All right, boys, in this video, I'm going to explain the theoretical differences between the three approaches. But before we understand the theoretical differences, we first have to go, well, what are they? What are the approaches? Before we can contrast, we need to know what they are. Okay, so by the end of this lesson, we're just going to focus on the theoretical assumptions, and the next video, we'll look at methods. Okay, you need to know this for your test. Okay, this is an important part of the marking criteria. So, generally speaking, we can say there are 7 different approaches to understanding human behavior. Okay, we've only studied 3: cognitive, biological, and sociocultural, or here it's called cross-cultural. Okay, there are others like the behaviorist approach, the psychodynamic, the evolutionary, which kind of falls under biological, and humanistic. What does this mean when we say these perspectives or approaches? Well, it's different ways of trying to explain behavior. The goal in psychology is to understand why do we do the things we do. So we can categorize how people try to answer this question by looking at the main explanations they give. Is it biological? Is it cognitive? Is it social and cultural? So if we look at the example of addiction, biological psychologists take a biological approach. They go, well, maybe people become addicted because there are maybe some genes that are involved, or hormone levels, or something's happening in their brain. A cognitive psychologist would make the assumption their addiction is based on their thoughts. And so they would study their thought patterns, how they think. What are their appraisals like? What about their locus of control? What about their working memory? Is that a factor? What about their beliefs? A social and cultural psychologist would start from the assumption their addiction is based on their environment and maybe what happened to them in their childhood. So all these external factors. All right. We have been studying PTSD, all right, and so biological psychologists take a biological approach by studying the cause of PTSD through biological factors. Cognitive psychologists would study thought patterns and what's happening in their mind. Social and cultural psychologists would look at what's happening in their environment or what happened in their environment when they were a kid. So it's important to note that when we say the approaches, we're really referring to research psychology done in universities, not applied psychology out in the field. So to start with the biological approach, these are the factors we've been looking at. And so here are some famous biological psychologists that haven't studied PTSD, but they've studied, probably the most famous, that take a biological approach to behavior. Adrian Raine looks at criminal behavior, top right. Sapolsky here with the impressive beard, he looks at criminal behavior, and he's also looked at stress. Molly Crockett has studied the effects of serotonin and what happens in neurotransmitter levels and how that affects our decision making. And Joseph Ledoux has studied the amygdala in great detail to look at its role in the fear response. So he's very relevant to the study of PTSD. So these are biological psychologists who use the biological approach. And they all start from the same assumption that our behavior is influenced by our genetics, right, or our brain, or our hormone neurotransmitter levels. And so they focus on internal factors, which are looking at our nature, right? This is the fundamental assumption of the biological approach. The sociocultural approach to PTSD would look at things like a socioeconomic status, that's an external factor, the social support around us, and our childhood, our adverse childhood experiences. So some famous social cultural psychologists who use this approach, again, not directly linked to PTSD, but they take a sociocultural approach, would be Bandura. He studied social learning and looked at how our behavior could be influenced by observing those around us. Solomon Asch studied conformity and how people's behavior can be shaped by the behavior of other people. Henry Tajfel looked at in-group, out-group behavior. He was a Polish Jew who escaped Germany and wanted to know how did the Holocaust happen. And so he looked at how belonging to a group and your sense of belonging to the group can shape your behavior. And Michael Marmot is probably the most relevant for our studies of PTSD because he looked at status and led a longitudinal study in the UK to show how low status correlates with poor health. So again, all of these social cultural psychologists take the socio-cultural approach, and they make the same assumption that our behavior is influenced by our environment. And they all would pick, and they all did, choose a specific environmental factor to focus on, whether or not it was our peers for Asch, or our social status for Marmot, Bandura, adults around us or media, and Tajval, our groups. So these are external factors, and it's looking more at the role of nurture. Cognitive psychology, did I miss a slide? No. Famous cognitive psychologists, would be Baddeley, Alan Baddeley. He studied the working memory model. He's the bottom right. We have Richard Lazarus and Folkman. I want to say Susan Folkman. They came up with the appraisal theory of stress and emotion, highly relevant to our studies of PTSD. And here we have Kahneman and Tversky. They propose the dual model process of thinking. So these people will use a cognitive approach. And I forgot to change my slides, so I'll explain it here. You can guess, right? What is their fundamental assumption about human behavior? It starts from our thoughts. Our thoughts influence our behavior. And so that's what they're focusing on. So they're looking at internal, unobservable, but definitely measurable factors. Okay. Sorry, different slides, but yes, right. Memories, thoughts, appraisals, perceptions, judgments. Now we know what they are, and I've summarized for you their key theoretical assumptions. You should be able to find some ways we can highlight the differences. Okay, so the words in bold here. Now, what you choose to highlight and the terminology you use will depend on which two approaches you are comparing. For example, you won't try to contrast the theoretical assumptions of biological and cognitive by talking about internal factors because they're both focused on internal factors. Maybe you would talk about observable and invisible. We can't see your thinking, we can see definitely your hormone levels and your brain activity. Or biological is quite simple, it's nature or it's nurture. Sociocultural to comparing to cognitive could be external or internal, or observable and invisible. So I hope this now gives you an understanding of how you can, in 2 to 3 sentences, write a clear contrast of the theoretical differences between two approaches. Here is an example contrasting the behaviors from the psychodynamic. I won't read this out. This is it straight from the exemplar, and you can pause the video to read it yourself. And here is another one contrasting the evolutionary from the psychodynamic. Right, next video is methodological. I can't think of how I can explain the theoretical differences any clearer or lay it out any more simply. So it's on you now. Good luck.